Welcome aboard Narrowboat George. We've got Ted at the back. He's our skipper for the trip. He'll be driving the boat. My name's Ricky. I'll be your guide. I'm sat in the middle. If you've got any questions or queries, please shout up. We'll see if we can support you on that. So here we go, into the Dudley Tunnel. Entering the Dudley Tunnel from the northeast side, and we're going in through the Tipton portal. Dudley Tunnel is 1.9 miles long. However, we're not doing the full distance, it's only a short trip in, and then we go down to the limestone mines. The tunnel was constructed by the Earl of Dudley, also known as Lord Ward. It was constructed in 1778 to allow Lord Ward to get his canal boats into the limestone mines. Once he could get his boats into the limestone mines, this allowed him to ship his cargo out of the mines and transport them up and down the country on the canals and waterways. Prior to this would have been done by horse and cart, and that restricted his travel to weight limits of around 1 to 2 tonne at a time, whereas on the boats you could get up to 30 tonne. So it was a lot more efficient. As you go through the tunnel, you'll notice these strange looking deposits on the tunnel walls. This is something called calcite. It's formed by the rainwater on the top, filtering down through the rocks above it, where it picks up the minerals. As it runs into the tunnel, the water evaporates, leaving the minerals behind. Like I say, it forms this calcite. It's very similar to limestone, what we get at home around your taps and in your kettles. And if you didn't clean your shower screen for 200 years, it would look very similar to this. As you're going down, you'll notice the holes in the tunnel walls. These were all part of the construction. You have to remember the tunnel starts 4 or 5 feet below the boat, so they'd start building up from the bottom, and the higher they got, the more difficult it was to reach. So they'd leave these holes out. This would allow them to put a plank or a board across. They could climb up it and use it as a type of scaffolding. Just at the front of the boat now, come hold on to your hats and take a look up. You'll see one of our construction shafts. There are 13 of these construction shafts throughout the length of the tunnel, and I'll tell you more about them as we go along. This brings us out into our first open air basin. This is called Shirtsmill Basin. We've got 2 mines in Shirtsmill. The mine over on the left, it looks like an old cave. That's flooded mine. And then there's a mine over on the right, which is the one behind me. Looks like a railway tunnel. And that's Tipton mine. It's a shaft mine. It goes back into the hill about 10 metres, then drops down 80 to 100 feet below us. It's where the majority of the mines in this area are, 80 to 100 feet below us. Unfortunately, they're all either flooded or being collapsed, so we've got no access into them now. Just a short connecting tunnel between the 2 basins, and then we'll come out into Castle Mill Basin. As we leave the tunnel, if you look over to the right hand side, you'll see another tunnel entrance. That's the Wren's Nest portal. Goes back about 1/4 of a mile under the Wren's Nest hill, where it comes out a huge cavern known as the Seven Sisters Cavern. Again, that's been filled in previously for safety reasons, so we've no longer got access into there. In front of the boat again, you'll see 2 more tunnels. The tunnel over on the right, the older looking tunnel, that's a continuation of the Dudley Tunnel. All being well, we'll be coming back out on that tunnel later on in our journey. But we're aiming for the tunnel on the left. This is known as the 89 Tunnel. So called because it was built in 1989. It's our newest tunnel down in the complex. And it was built to allow us to do a circular trip around the mines. It's built using a system called egg box construction. It's locally known by the skippers as the Waffle Tunnel. It's only a short section of tunnel, and you'll notice it changing at the front of the boat now. This is because when they were digging it out in 1989, they came across another seam of limestone that the miners back in the 1800s had missed. So rather than continue blasting through the hard rock, They decided to follow the softer seam of the limestone. This explains why the tunnel twists and turns. So we're now approximately about 200 feet below the surface. It's always a good time to tell you about the earthquakes that we have. Last big earthquake, September 2002, 4.5 on the Richter scale. Caused quite a rumble up on the surface. However, we were quite lucky down in the caverns, as we were aware of our weak spots, which is the next area coming up, with the red lights around it. This is the Castle Hill fault line. As like I say, we were aware it was a weak spot. So many years ago, there was a big steel spring installed around the inside of the tunnel. It goes all the way around. Allows the tunnel to flex and move with the earth around it, but prevents any collapse. As we leave this tunnel, we'll come into our first mine. This is called Little Tess. Got a show on the left-hand side. It's only 4 or 5 minutes long, just to explain some of the history and geology of the hillside. Just coming up on the screen now, you'll see the name of just a few of the miners that lost their lives working down in these caverns. Over the years, there would have been hundreds killed, with thousands being injured. It got that bad, they even built a hospital up on the main road, the old Dudley Canal Hospital, just to support the miners working down in this area. Right, we're going to continue our journey. But just as we go through, behind that big screen we've been looking at is our biggest cavern. It's called Dark Cavern. It's all been filled in now, so we can't get in there. But it's a huge space, rumoured to be similar to sort of capacity as St Paul's Cathedral. And back in the mid-1500s or 1800s, the Victorians turned it into an exhibition cavern. There was steps from the surface. There was lighting installed down there. There was a bandstand and stage, and they used to do shows and performances with thousands of people coming down to visit them. So this is Rock Tunnel. This is our oldest tunnel down here. This was here way before the canals. It would have originally been a track and minecart tunnel. And this is where the children would have started working. Boys from the age of 9, girls from the age of 12, working down here 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, pushing the minecarts from one end of the tunnel and unloading at the other end. Coming up on the right hand side now, we've got the 2 illuminated areas. These are just good examples of the calcite formations. On this next section, if you look up to the roof of the cavern of the tunnel, you'll see the small stalactites forming. We're now coming down into our biggest accessible cavern. This is called Singing Cavern. Again, we've got another show up on the left-hand wall. 2 big screens on the rock face. There's also a light show in here. So hold on to your hats and have a good look around. It is very dark when we first go in, but once the show starts, the lights will come on.
Limestone was quarried here on Dudley Castle Hill for hundreds of years, but the arrival of the canal prompted a rapid increase in mining activity, and at its peak, the Dudley mines produced over 100,000 tons of limestone a year. The extraction of the stone left behind a network of vast caverns, which became an attraction for scientists, engineers, and visiting dignitaries from abroad. The Dudley Caverns have also played an important role in the development of the science of geology, and became renowned internationally for the quality and diversity of the fossils that have been discovered here. In 1849, addressing a meeting of scientists here in the Dudley mines, the eminent geologist Sir Roderick Murchison proclaimed that in no part of England are more geological features brought together in a small compass than in the environs of Dudley. In the 1850s, the caverns were opened to the public. Gas lighting was installed, paths laid out, and a bandstand constructed. Many fetes and concerts were held in these mines, with entertainment provided by orchestras, choirs, and military bands. Coloured fairs were ignited, and demonstrations of blasting carried out. Those events were perhaps the forerunner of today's classical spectacular concerts. And although some of the mines were accessible from the surface, many visitors came by canal boat, just as you have today. Since those times, technology has moved on, and we no longer have to risk the dangers of gas and gunpowder to provide light and sound. But imagine for a moment the awe and amazement of those early visitors as we present our modern interpretation of those events nearly 200 years ago.
Welcome to Singing Cavern. It's quite impressive, isn't it? Just before we put the lights on the boat, if you want to follow my torchlight, I'll pick out some of the highlights of the cavern. If we look up to the back of the boat, up to the top corner, you'll see the original entrance into the mine. Big steel plates up there now, stop anybody else getting in. But it would have been a drift mine. It's where the miners would have dug in through the side of the hill. You have to remember at the time, this would have all been solid rock in here. So they dig in from there, start slowly working the way, digging the way across the top seam, extracting all the limestone as they went along. When they got to the farthest point, there was no more limestone, so they'd start digging out and down. Obviously, the further down they got, the more they realised they needed some support for the ceilings. This is why we've got these 6 huge pillars that the miners had left to support the roof. There'd be several more of them going on down through the front of the boat, and the tunnel continues for another quarter of a mile or so. Comes out underneath Dudley Zoo. Each of these pillars estimated to weigh between 3.5 and 400 tonne each. Look up to the top there, you'll see a hole. We think that was one of the original test holes, where the miners would have dug down from the top to check the quality and the type of limestone it was before coming in through the side. Just to give you an idea, the bottom of that hole is roughly 40 to 50 feet below the surface. So it just shows how far down below we are. We're just going to pop the lights back on the boat, so just mind your eyes. 3, 2, 1. And if you could take your seats again, we'll continue on our journey. The rest of the journey we'll be doing in reverse. And we'll be heading back out to the 84 tunnel. One day, one guy came in, got through the barriers and broke in. And he came down into the tunnels and he brought a piece of paper with him, with his name and a phone number on there. And a message on the back saying if there's anybody else that's interested in these tunnels, please get in touch. And he put this message in a bottle. And he put the bottle in the hole in one of the holes in the tunnel, in the main tunnel. Several months later, we had a phone call. Somebody had come down and found this bottle. And they made contact with each other. They were actually meeting up on the surface. They got together and decided both what they wanted to keep the tunnel open. So then in 1964, they formed the Dudley Canal Tunnel Trust. And it's thanks to those guys then that we're here today. As I say, this is the 1984 tunnel. Same construction as the Waffle tunnel when we came in on, only without the concrete sprayed on. Very simple construction, big concrete hoops go all the way around the boat, and they're just bolted together. It's the same as they use on the London Underground, Paris Metro, and even the Channel Tunnel, with a very similar construction. And this is Singing Cavern. Singing Cavern was one of the last mines down here to be mined. But unfortunately, it was closed in the 1920s due to a roof fall, injuring some of the miners working down here. But the display we've got here shows the mining in the 1700s, mining by candlelight. It would probably have been darker than this originally, as they wouldn't have had the extra light coming in through the well like we have. But this is Arthur. And Arthur's job down here would be to load all the limestone onto the boats. A boat similar to this would be tied up here, and Arthur would be expected to put about 30 tonne of limestone onto the boat. And he'd get the limestone, and these guys at the back, if they start working, here they go. As you can see, big iron rod and a hammer, and they're knocking it into the rock face. I have to remember back in the 1700s they wouldn't have had drills or power tools like we have now to make a hole. So to make that hole they'd be knocking that rod into the rock face, twisting and turning so it didn't get stuck. They'd knock it into a depth of about ½ a metre or so. They'd then pull the rod out and pack the hole with explosives, probably some blasting powder. Then, strangely enough, they'd turn the metal bar around and ram it back into the hole to compress the gunpowder or the blasting powder. Obviously this was quite dangerous because a steel bar against stone creates sparks. And quite a few miners were injured and even killed carrying out this practice. However, it was the way they did it. So once they'd completed that, they'd put a fuse into the hole, normally an old piece of rope or something soaked in oil, and they'd run it to the far end of the cavern, at which point they'd call the mine foreman in to inspect the work.
Get ready to blast! Stand clear!
He'd send everybody out the mine if he was that big. Everybody except one person. This is little Billy, again one of the children working in the mines. 9, 10 years old, left down here on his own. And his job would be to light the fuse. As I mentioned, it was quite a poor quality fuse, and quite regularly it would go out, so he'd have to get up and relight it. It would go out again, so again he'd have to get up and relight it, each time putting himself closer and closer to the blast zone. Majority of the time, young Billy wouldn't have time to get out of the cavern before it blasts, so he'd have to run back and hide behind one of the mine carts. He'd crouch down, hands over his ears, eyes closed, holding his breath, praying that he'd survive the next blast.
Clear!
There he is, you can hear him coughing. He'd crawl out from behind the mine cart, dust himself off, and all the miners would come back in, and they'd just start work again. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Can you imagine the conditions now there's just been a blast? There'd be rockfall everywhere, the lime dust, fumes off the explosion. It was cold, it was dark, it was very damp, It probably explains why the average lifespan of the miners working down here was around 28 years old. If you could take your seats again, please, we'll continue on our journey. We've got another one of the construction shafts coming up at the back of the boat now. This one does have a lot of pretty colours up there, so it is worth having a look. However, it can be very, very drippy. So if you are brave enough to have a look up there, hold on to your hats. As we come back into this next section of tunnel, have a look at the brickwork in the ceiling. Compare it to the walls. The walls were built in the 1930s. These are all machine-made bricks. However, the bricks in the ceiling here, these are all the handmade bricks. They'd be handmade by the miners' wives, normally the miners' daughters. They'd be expected to work upon the surface from the age of 5 until they were 12, and old enough to come down into the caverns. There's approximately 8 million of these handmade bricks throughout the length of our tunnel. Now coming into the next area, this is Cathedral Arch. This is where 3 tunnels meet. Gets its name from the arch in the ceiling, resembling that of the cathedral. Over on the left, you'll see 2 working boats tied up there. Original working boats would have been wooden, however these are steel, but it gives you an idea of what sort of size and shape they look like. At the back of the tunnel, you know what's all blocked off. That there would have been the original tunnel into Little Test where we saw the first film. But unfortunately, back in the early 1960s, the roof collapsed, preventing us getting any more boat trips through there. Hence, we had to build the 1984 tunnel, which we've just come back up. So we can get the trips going back in there again. You'll notice on those 2 boats there's no engines, which up on the surface wasn't such a big problem, because there's towpaths on the canals, and the boats could be crawled along by hauls. However, down here was a different story. We've got no towpaths, and you wouldn't be able to get your wharf down anyway. So how would the boatmen get the boats through the tunnels? Well, first of all, they came up with something called barging. We looked at the back of the boat, you'll see Ted, the barge pole, and then it was a quick demonstration. The boatman would have a big wooden pole with a metal spike on the end of it. And they'd barge that into the wall, propelling the boat as it went down. However, if you look at all the brickwork as we go in, you'll see all the damage it used to cause. So not long after they started doing it, it was banned. The Earl of Dudley wouldn't allow any barging in the tunnels. So they had to come up with another way. So they came up with something called legging. This is where the boatmen would either climb on top of the cargo, or they'd have a wooden legging board across the middle of the boat. And they'd lie there back to back, with the feet on the walls, and they'd walk down the walls of the tunnel, propelling the boat as it went down. So we just so happened to have a wooden legging board across the middle of our boat. So if anybody wants to have a go, volunteers, 2 people, to have a go at legging. Anybody interested? No?
No.
Nobody brave enough? You're stupid enough. Okay, Ted, carry on. So like I say, they'd lie on the backs, put the feet on the tunnel walls, and they'd walk down the tunnel walls. They'd have a time limit of just over 2 hours to do the 1.9 miles of tunnel. And this was because it was a really busy tunnel in its day, and boats used to queue up for 2 or 3 days at a time either end of the tunnel, waiting for their slot to come through. If they ran over that time limit, they'd be penalised because it would hold everybody else up. We have records showing that in 1853. We have records showing in 1853 that there were over 41,000 boats a year using this tunnel. 41,000 boats. Can you imagine that? Being a constant stream of boats coming through. One day they'd do one direction, the next day they'd do the opposite direction. And we're heading back out into Castle Mill Basin. This area would originally have been a cabin like we've just been through, with a roof over it. However, because of the way it was mined in the 1800s, there was a roof fall, which fell in, killing several of the miners. It was quite unfortunate for them. However, it was quite lucky for us because it lets a bit of sunlight in. It's quite pleasant in the summer's day.
Hard-working boater and sharp as a knife. I've worked on the junction for most of my life, with a pair of steel boats, 7 kids and a wife, and I fancy I'll carry on boating. I've fought with me windlass and taken some knocks from the Brummagem wars to the Western Point docks, and I fought for me turn on the Camden Town locks when I'm wanted in Limehouse for loading. Myself and me missus have nearly been drowned when working by night on the 15-mile with a big load of spelter for Birmingham bound, and the weather has been pretty bloody.
So we're backing out again into Shirtsville Basin. If you remember on the way in, Look at you, we've got two mines in Churchmill. The one behind me, which was Tipton mine, that's the one that went back and then dropped down, the shaft mine, dropped down 80 feet below us. This time, if we look over to the left-hand side of the boat, side in front of me, we'll see flooded mine. That's the one that looks like an old cave. Again, that was one of the old drift mines. Went back into the hillside 200 or 300 metres. And it was called flooded mine because the miners working in there were generally working knee deep in water. 12 hours a day, knee deep in water. Have to remember back in those days they wouldn't have had waterproofs or Wellingtons like we have nowadays. They'd been working in there barefooted. There were 13 of these construction shafts throughout the length of the tunnel. And the purpose of them was to increase the speed that they built the tunnel in. Rather than have a team of miners at one end of the hill, and a team of miners at the opposite end of the hill digging in. And they sank 13 shafts down. They sank them all down to the same depth. And this enabled them to send multiple teams of miners into each of the shafts, and then dig out in opposite directions. Like I say, this greatly increased the speed the tunnels were dug out. However, it did have its downsides. Probably explains why the tunnels aren't always straight and are slightly different heights. Because back in those days they wouldn't have had the technology to line them. Throughout the year we do several different boat trips. We've just done the 45-minute cavern tour. We do a really nice 4-hour trip which goes out through the main tunnel to Parkhead and back. That's really nice because we do it by candlelight. So it's like the miners would have originally done it. We play a few of the old mining songs, tell you some of the stories as we go along. So it's a really nice authentic trip. We also do a 6-hour trip which goes out through the main tunnel. And then we go round to our local nature reserve at Bulbul Hall, where we stop and we have refreshments, quick look round the visitor centre before getting back on the boat and then heading off down the end of the tunnel. So as we're coming to the end of our trip now, hopefully you've all enjoyed it and found it informative. So on behalf of Dudley Canal Tunnel Trust, myself and Ted, I'd like to thank you all for coming. Because without your guys' support, we wouldn't be able to keep the tunnels open and the trips going for the future generations to see how
You can talk of your rail and your whole highway code, but there's not like a pair with a 50-ton load when your buddy swims well and you get a good road right over the Cowras to Leighton.